HBC system in California from other sources, particularly from tuition. So there's a tendency for many schools now to welcome more and more foreign students, and there's more and more interest in China for students to come and study here. Indeed, there are, as many of you may know from living and working in this community, there are increasing numbers of Chinese families buying homes here in Puget Sound so they can send their children to American high schools to get a jump start on getting into American universities. So this is a huge trend and a great demographic shift that plays into the same issues that we were just talking about in terms of the historical precedents and the financial and economic pressures that grow. One of the other interesting trends is, as you can see down at the bottom of this slide, the Chinese enrollment is beginning to differentiate. In the past, almost always Chinese came here for a master's or PhD degree. They did not come here for their baccalaureate. Now, almost half of the foreign students from China are coming here for their primary bachelor's degree. So we're seeing the pressure and the change shift to a much, much earlier time. My son Phil, who's here in the audience today, was a school teacher in Changsha, in Hunan province, a couple of years ago. And Diana and I went to visit his classroom, which was in Changsha. And in that classroom of 12-year-old Chinese, there was already a very sophisticated interest among those 12-year-old students in Changsha about American universities and whether it was easier to take the SAT or the Gaokao in China. I mean, these are 12-year-old children. You know, it was just extraordinary how much pressure is placed upon children today in China to move toward this system. And so what we have here are a huge set of socioeconomic factors that are much larger than individuals, but they result in these large demographic changes. And so now you have, in the final bullet here, we have Chinese students making up almost 1 in every 5 engineering students in the United States currently. You know, that's just an extraordinary thing that has no precedent in American history. And what that does to the workforce then for the United States. This bar graph really demonstrates, you know, graphically, I think engineers and scientists like graphs, so we threw one in here, you know, just to show you that George and I can do this. But you can see the growth curve. It's just extraordinary. There is no other precedent for this in American educational history, to see this kind of rise in enrollment. And so this then feeds science, technology, engineering, mathematics workers into the American workforce. And when James gave us the sign-up sheet for the registration for this program, we saw that a very high preponderance of you in this audience work either for Boeing or Microsoft or another technology-based company. It's not surprising that the Chinese Institute of Engineers and the Society of Chinese American Aerospace Engineers, you know, represent just the peak of that, you know, the tip. But this is a very important thing. Excuse me, I'm sorry. American industry, clearly across the board, in electronics, in aerospace, in telecommunications, in medical devices, pharmaceuticals, in virtually any field of technology today, chemical engineering, which is George's discipline, all depend upon immigrant engineers. Even in Silicon Valley, where George and I both used to work together, probably 1 in every 2 startup companies there is founded by an immigrant from China or India. 1 in every 2 startups in the valley from China or India.
A Berkeley professor made a study on this subject matter, and she said, IC in Silicon Valley stands for Indians and Chinese.
I have heard it said, you know, I just came back from my first business trip to India, but, you know, there they say, sorry, George, you know, those who can't get into IIT go to MIT.
Well, that's probably true, and that shows the limitation of India, is that they have not broadened their educational base to accept a greater percentage. They're very narrow, very exclusive.
But
We're getting out of the.
Back to the subject.
Okay.
So now I've given you this big demographic picture. So now we're going to switch gears and we're going to talk to you about official public government studies that are current government studies that talk about the official perspective of the U.S. government about the intelligence activities being conducted by the Chinese government in this country.
So it's important that whether this is true or not, or accurate or not, doesn't matter. What matters is this is the official position of the United States government on various different agencies. So what does this slide say? Let me just read you the one part which is verbatim from the report, from this particular report. It's entitled Foreign Spy Stealing U.S. Economic Secrets in Cyberspace. China's intelligence services, as well as private companies and other entities, frequently seek to exploit Chinese citizens or persons with family ties to China who can use their insider access to corporate networks to steal trade secrets using removable media devices or email. Okay? The grains of sand theory is applying right here. Okay? Of the 7 cases that were adjudicated under the Economic Espionage Act, etc., 6 of them involve a link to China. So that's what this particular slide is telling you, one of the official positions.
These are public documents. You can have access to them. I use them for my work all the time. But this is a declassified, unclassified document that is produced by the Office of National Counterintelligence Executive. So this is right at the top of the chain. It involves all the agencies such as the CIA, the FBI, the DIA, and the other intelligence services in the U.S. government. There's a coordinating office at the top. That coordinating office issued this report. And if you look here, they don't make any bones. You know, they talk about Wall Street, and then whose currency is on the cover of this. This report talks very specifically about China and the risk that the U.S. intelligence services see in Chinese.
By the way, if you didn't pick one out, we actually have our slides in the handout form in the back, so that you won't have to take notes, or you can write your notes right on the slide.
Right, and if you have friends and colleagues who weren't able to come today, please feel free to help yourself to another copy and take those with you. We want people to be able to read this material. There's a lot of interest today in cybersecurity, and obviously the recent hacking of the Target system and a number of other systems around the country really makes clear that we're all, to one extent or another, very vulnerable to cyber spying. The Snowden papers make it clear that the U.S. spies as well. But these reports indicate that within the U.S. counterintelligence service, they view China officially and unofficially as the source of a large percentage of the cyber attacks being taken against U.S. government networks and against corporate networks. I have friends who are, and colleagues and clients who are IT professionals who deal in cybersecurity, and some of them report 5, 10, 20,000 attacks a week that they can track through their forensic materials from China or Russia. Are the 2 largest sources of this kind of activity. Increasingly, we also see it from Iran. But I think this quotation, again, circled there in red, gives you some idea. When they say China is the world's most active, they put China at the very top of the risk profile here in terms of this kind of spying.
This is one nation or one government's point of view. And hadn't been for Snowden, I think this is the only point of view that would exist. But thanks to Mr. Snowden, we know that even more active than the alleged activities from China is our own very NSA. So that puts it somewhat in balance.
Let me make a distinction here, and I've heard it made officially by U.S. government officials. In the U.S. view, spying has traditionally always gone on and is actually respected among foreign intelligence services. We expect the Chinese to spy on us officially, and they expect us to spy on them officially. We spy on Israel, we spy on the United Kingdom, we spy everywhere, because that's our national government's job, is to look for those kinds of things. Every country, to one extent or another, has done that. And if you read the history of spying, which sometimes I do for fun, you'll find that there's great precedent. And the Chinese have done it for centuries. There are whole books written on how Imperial China had spies everywhere in an effort to maintain order and security for Imperial China. And so there is nothing unusual about spying. The distinction that the U.S. government has been drawing more and more with the Chinese government in direct face-to-face discussions is that the view of the new modern China, where there's so much private, so-called private economic activity, and there are so many state-owned enterprises, that the Chinese government has migrated from spying for national security purposes to spying for economic development purposes and for helping launch more and more of their state-owned enterprises to be successful in the commercial market. And as you'll see in some of the presentations here, some of the cases that are happening in the United States involving Chinese-American engineers and scientists have nothing to do with national security in the traditional sense, have nothing to do with military technology. They do have to do with very valuable trade secret information of leading technology companies.
In other words, our kind of spying is acceptable, their kind of spying is not.
Yes. In the U.S., because of the sensitivity about China and its potential military capabilities, Congress has passed a law that requires the Department of Defense every year to write a report specifically summarizing the threat posed by Chinese military forces and the Chinese defense establishment. They write this report in two forms. There's a classified version that goes to Congress and an unclassified version. This is available publicly on the Department of Defense website. I'm holding in my hands the most recent edition of this report, the unclassified version. And I've given you here a direct quotation from this report. And I ask you just take a moment to read this language, either on the slide or on your handout. Once again, George and I are not trying to argue whether these conclusions are right or wrong, whether they're accurate or inaccurate, but these are official statements issued by the Secretary of Defense pursuant to law to report to Congress, their official perspective. So this is the perspective of the U.S. Defense Department about what China is doing to collect information in a way that is illegal.
So this is the perception that exists and pervades in the United States government, whether it's the executive branch or the congressional branch, and we will hear other example, specific cases as we go on. So it's important to keep in mind that that's the bias that exists there, reflected in these statements.
Sometimes in observational social science, and there is a phenomenon called observational bias, where if you expect to see something, you're more likely, in fact, to see it.
Yeah.
And so what we're trying to help you understand is how conditioned the American government is right now to seeing activity as being illegal and as being a direct threat to U.S. national security. And so keep that in mind as we go into this material. But we've given you 3 examples of official reports that present to you pretty much accurately what the government thinks it's seeing. So now I'm going to drift into some legalisms here. And with apologies to Dean Clark and my colleague Lori Bonai, I'm going to try to apologize a little bit for the American legal system. But it is the most costly and complex legal system probably in the world. We have lots of different aspects of the American legal system that are going to be touched on in the cases that we're going to describe to you. But obviously, for all legal systems around the world, there's always been the notion of criminal activity, whether you're talking about ancient Rome, ancient Greece, ancient China, ancient India, and certainly in the Western societies, there have always been criminal laws. There are increasingly, as governments have become more sophisticated and more involved in economic activity, there are things called administrative proceedings that are not crimes. And then in the more sophisticated societies with court systems, there are private legal actions that can be brought that have nothing to do with the government. Now, the first 2 kinds, criminal and administrative, are initiated by the government. But civil litigation is between private parties. They don't necessarily involve the government at all. And so this causes people to be brought into contact with the legal system, which imposes certain kinds of legal expenses and potential for great reputational damage, because almost all of these proceedings are public and they become the focus of media attention and so on. If you get caught up in some of this kind of activity, it can really disrupt your normal work life. It can harm your business relationships. It can even have effects on the immigration status of your families, of loved ones, and so on. So there are many ripple effects once you get into this thing. So in the United States in particular, there are 4 different kinds of laws that are going to touch Chinese Americans, particularly in the STEM areas, where you work in science and engineering and technology fields. And we're going to go through all of those in a very quick way to give you some understanding of how they work and how they overlap. All right? We're going to talk about espionage laws that are government espionage, real true classical spying and trying to steal military secrets or secrets about the deployment of armed forces or intelligence activities, that sort of thing. We're going to talk about a new kind of espionage called economic espionage, which does not necessarily have to be tied to government activity at all. But that's the term that's been applied, and that means getting access to people's private, valuable information. It could be sales data, it could be specifications, it could be blueprints, it could be chemical formulas, it could be software codes. These have nothing to do with the traditional classical form of espionage, but it's really aimed at promoting the development illicitly of economic and technological progress by stealing somebody else's secrets. Third basket of laws are export control laws. There are some technologies that are viewed as so sensitive that they're subject to these special laws that require government permission to transfer them to other countries. And then last but not least, the United States has criminalized a whole series of activities connected to the use of computers. And so we hear in the newspapers all the time and in the news media about hacking cases and so on. So I'm going to walk you through some of the laws on these computer crimes. So, you know, we all grew up using dictionaries, so I gave you a dictionary definition. When you go to the dictionary, the Merriam-Webster one, it says the practice of spying or using spies to obtain information about plans and activities, especially of a foreign government or a competing company. So those are the 2 prongs: spying against a government, spying against a company. So increasingly, we see 2 arms of these laws. There's kind of a public espionage, which are aimed at government secrets, and private or industrial espionage that are aimed at business secrets. Last night, we were honored to go to dinner with some of the CIE leadership. And at the dinner, we discussed that today, both forms of espionage are subject to U.S. criminal laws. Everybody sort of understands that there's a crime of spying against governments. But today in the United States, there's a separate crime for spying on companies. You know, and it's more, so even if you're only, quote unquote, only stealing your company's secret, it's not just a matter of violating your non-disclosure agreement. Now, the company that is the victim of that theft can report you to the FBI, and you can be prosecuted in court for a crime of stealing an industrial secret. And that's different. That didn't used to be the law. So here I'm giving you just, quickly, the government espionage, the public espionage laws currently go back to 1917. So these laws have been on the U.S. books for almost a century. And these are the different forms that are very classical. So we're talking about giving up defense information, gathering defense information to the injury of the United States, or to help another country, taking out classified cryptography equipment or decryption equipment, things like that. So these are very specialized statutes that are only used in the most serious cases. Almost always, this kind of case is brought against somebody who worked for the government itself and had a security clearance and had access to this kind of information, or somebody who works for a defense contractor, like the military side of Poland, or BAE Systems, or Northrop Grumman, people like that. So, those people are really at risk for this kind of prosecution. But the economic espionage laws are really new. These only came into effect in 1996, when Congress felt that there was not enough teeth to protect industrial secrets in the United States, and that there was more and more activity even inside the United States, never mind foreign companies. There was concern that one American company was stealing technology from another American company. And then they saw it also happening with overseas companies. So they criminalized this behavior. And then they split it into two parts. So economic espionage for a foreign government, they gave under Section 1831. And then economic espionage for a private company, they put under a separate law, Section 1832. Right? These are really nasty laws. Look at the penalties. We're talking 15 years in prison, a $5 million fine if you do it for government, 10 years in prison, $250,000 fine if you do it for a company. These are very, very nasty laws. They can ruin an individual to be prosecuted this way. So, what does economic espionage involve? It almost always involves something called a trade secret. So how many of you in this room have signed a non-disclosure agreement to work for your company? All right. So almost all of you know what I'm talking about. Those non-disclosure agreements are to protect company trade secrets. The legal definition, which is unfortunately a little cumbersome, says a trade secret is something that has independent economic value, is not generally known. That's why you sign an NDA, to cover it. Not generally known, and is kept secret through reasonable means, like a non-disclosure, like security systems, like electronic passes on the doors, badging, all of those things. Stamping documents, confidential, trade secret. So those things cover drawings, software, blueprints, pretty much everything across, the range of documents that you see every day in your workplaces. And also, they can involve the business information, non-technical information. Who are your sources of supply? If you have a unique component of something, and nobody else knows who's supplying that very valuable thing, that could be a trade secret. It can be in any media. It doesn't have to be written. It could be electronic. It could be oral. It could be something just stored in your head. As you can see there in the last bullet, we talk about some of the things that tell you that this is probably trade secret information. If you're working around an environment where they require passwords, where they have firewalls, where they have compartmentation of access, physical security, badging, all those things. You're in a trade secret world. So we're going to move over from trade secrets, and we're going to talk now about something that's actually one of my specialty areas, which is export control laws. So this is an area that I've worked in for over 30 years. It's very exotic in some ways. So in the main, U.S. export control laws come in three flavors. First, there are the big trade embargoes. So today, American companies can't trade with Cuba, can't trade with Iran, can't trade with Sudan, a handful of places like that, and thousands of people that are so-called specially designated nationals. You saw in the last month, President Obama adopted these new sanctions against Russians and Ukrainians because of the move by the Russians to annex the Crimean Peninsula into Russia. So those are the things that we talk about that are administered by the Office of Foreign Assets Control at the Treasury Department. Second flavor, so-called export administration regulations at the Department of Commerce. These are the dual use things. So technology that begins as civilian technology but can be used and applied for military purposes. Take, for example, a Honeywell air traffic radar control system installed at an airport like SeaTac or San Francisco or Los Angeles. It's capable of tracking many airplanes over a particular airspace all at one time and understanding their speed, their vector, their altitude, and can tag all of them. Well, the military says you could take that same basic civilian air traffic radar system and use it for an anti-aircraft control system. That could be the backbone. So technology of that kind that begins and is intended for civilian purposes but can be used for military purposes, they classify as dual use. And so the regulations are those administered at the Department of Commerce. Some of the things that are on the BIS or the Bureau of Industry and Security lists have to have a license to go to China. The last kind of controls are the most stringent, the strictest. And these are the international traffic in arms regulations, known in the trade as ITAR. For any of you who work at Boeing, the military side of Boeing is all controlled by ITAR. All right, and so these things are things that relate to fighters, to bombers, to missiles, to guns, to tanks, to all the things that you would think about that are used by the military. They also deal with the avionics and electronics and control systems. They deal with military encryption. They deal with all those kinds of things. The difference between the second flavor and the third flavor is very critical under U.S. law. In the second flavor, the dual use things, almost everything can be sold to China. Sometimes you have to go get a license, a permission to do it, but eventually you can sell it to China. If you're in the third flavor under ITAR, because of the sanctions imposed on China after 1989 and Tiananmen Square, the United States government has an official law that says no licenses can be given for anything that's ITAR controlled to China. It's not a discretionary thing. It's not a matter of making judgments about whether this tank is okay to sell and this tank is not. No tanks can go. No military technology can go to China. And this has big implications for how the Chinese naturally want to behave, because they don't like that policy. And they want access to that kind of technology because they're trying to improve and modernize their armed forces as well. So I'm giving you here the penalties to give you an idea again of how serious violations of these laws can be. For the embargoes, they're pretty stiff. For ITAR violations, and for the military technology things, the government divides this up into two kinds of fines. They can penalize you criminally. Right? This means they use the criminal process, but they also have an ability to move against you in an administrative process. So they have separate categories of fines. But these are, they can't imprison you here. This is only financial penalty. Here, you can go to prison if they find a real intentional violation. So these rules tell you something, tell lawyers something, which is that you don't have to show that you intended to break the law to suffer a civil penalty. The fact that you broke the law, even if you didn't intend to, exposes you to the civil fine. If you intended to break the law, and they can prove that, then you're going to be prosecuted criminally.